Well, okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Vermont Sierra Club Community Conversations. I'm Steve Crowley, your host, and with us tonight, we have a great discussion lined up. Art Gilman, a consulting botanist, who's the author of the new Flora of Vermont, is with us tonight to talk about invasive and exotic species. And we will have, the way this will work is we'll have maybe about a half an hour of presentation, and then we'll switch over to Q&A discussion. Please feel free to write any questions or notes or comments in the chat as we go, and we will use that as our stack for comments and questions. And I will mention that this is being recorded, so if you want to go back and look at it, tomorrow or the next day, Rob Kidd, with the Sierra Club, will be editing this and posting it on our website. So, and just so you know, it is being recorded, and if you want to have your face on or off the screen, you're in charge of that yourselves. So, and otherwise, meanwhile, I see everybody's on mute now, and it's great to stay on mute until it's Q&A time. And that's about it. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Art, who has some slides and a presentation to share. So to you, Art, welcome.
Well, as a consulting botanist, I was asked a few years ago by the Vermont Technical College in Randolph to teach the botany part of wetland delineations. They have a week-long course each spring or each fall for sort of a continuing education program. And so I've done that for 4 or 5 years and enjoy it very, very much. And this year, this past fall, I had a real live wire in my class named Suzanne Zella. And she asked me if I could give this class because she's very interested. Well, one day we were talking along, and it's a very informal class, just like this talk is very informal. And we were talking about the plants. We're out in the field talking about this plant and that plant as we were looking at the wetland boundaries. And I sort of offhandedly said, well, that's not a native plant, or that's a native plant. And oh, don't worry about that. That's it's a European plant, but it's often in wetlands and so forth. And she said to me, so what do you mean it's native or it's not native? What are you talking about? And so I sort of extemporaneously gave a small lecture to the whole group of people. I think there were 6 or 7 of us in the class this year, and I gave a sort of extemporaneous talk about it. And it's really very interesting subject. It's something I've been interested in for a long time. As Steve said in the introduction, I wrote the new Flora of Vermont. And I had to learn basically, well, I knew a lot of the plants. I knew most of the plants in the state, but I had to learn all the rest of them. And in doing so, and in putting in the book the information as to whether the plant was native or not in Vermont was a task that I had to do to make the book complete. And so, and of course, there's been a lot of rumblings in the background for a long period of time about invasive species and non-native invasives and nuisance aquatic plants, many of which are invasive. So I really studied it quite a bit. We have plants from all over the world that grow in Vermont. We have plants that are native from India, from Japan, from China, from Europe, from South Africa, and from South America. A lot of Southwestern American plants are in Vermont. Of course, a lot of things that are sort of native, not very far to our south. And the question then becomes, well, if they're not very far away and we're having global warming, will they be native here at some point? So there's a kind of a philosophical question as to what is native and what it means to be native. So I put together a PowerPoint presentation, and I will start screen sharing now. Hopefully this will work beautifully. So I have about 15 or 20 slides here. And I thought I'd start with this plant, which is a little bit problematic to know whether it's native or not. This is a European orchid called Epipactis helleborine, or false hellebore orchid. And it was not known to North American botanists early on, but around 1875, it was discovered near Syracuse, New York. And it was sort of a sensation at the time. Here's this orchid, it's known in Europe. And people here were sort of amazed because orchids are, as most botanists know, orchids are very chancy things. They don't grow everywhere. They're very fussy as to where they will grow. And especially the terrestrial species, which are the only ones we have, require a very particular fungus for them to get started and to do well. But today, this can be seen growing in road shoulders, edges of parking lots, any manner of forests, and sort of all over. Weed in a garden once in a while. So people have tracked this from the center near Syracuse with its expanding range over time to sort of concentric circles. This wave has moved away from Syracuse. And it reached Vermont about 1920. And now it's sort of ubiquitous across the state. So the question is this native? And how do we know? So we have a few little things here. We have a little problem with time because nothing was native here when the glaciers left, a mere 10,000 years ago, very short period of time. And we think in many ways, we're still rebounding from the glacial period. And so I think this probably came here naturally. The seeds of your orchids are very small, very tiny, and they flow around the world in the jet stream. And it appears that it's appeared in New York State 125 years ago or so. So there's that question of time. There's a question of evidence. Do we think it's, if we discover something new in the state, do we automatically think it's native, or do we automatically think it's introduced or non-native? And that comes about, we look at for evidence that somebody saw it 100 years ago, or the earlier botanists, 1840s, saw it in the state or not. But it's very difficult to know. And then we have a little problem with human nature, which I will get to towards the end of the presentation. So here's another case that's quite interesting. This is Tulip Tree, member of the laurel family. It forms massive trees. It's a very common plant in the Great Appalachian Forests in the eastern half of the United States. The beautiful tree grows to be enormous and is very good for furniture and so forth. It's called yellow poplar in some areas. Well, there are apparently a small set of trees in the town of Pownell that we think are native. And the botanists have argued back and forth over about 100 years or so, from the time the Vermont Botanical and Bird Club was first started, in the late, about 1900. And there are articles in there saying, well, we saw a tree of tulip tree in Bennington, and that makes the third one native in the state. But here, this picture was taken in the town of Charlotte, where there had been a small nursery with some tulip trees, and it was seeding around rather naturally into the woods in Charlotte. So that is a question of, is it native or is it not? And will it become native with warming climate? This species was actually added to the Vermont list of threatened and endangered species recently. And the discussions in the Flora Advisory Group centered on, well, what happens if we make it threatened and endangered and all of a sudden it's moving into the state rapidly? Do we keep it threatened and endangered then, or what? As it currently stands, the idea is if it's growing in Chittenden County, or I think the champion tree for this in the state is in Montpelier, on Berry Street, an enormous tree. If it is growing in cultivation or escaped from cultivation, then it's not a threatened species, but the native populations are. So that is a little bit of a hint of the problem of human nature. What do we want it to be? Do we want it to be rare and native, or do we want it to be functional in the landscape, or what? So it's an interesting case history with the tulip tree. And speaking of climate change, it's easier to lose plants due to climate change than it is to replace them by natural movements. In other words, many of the plants on top of Mount Mansfield, or the cold adapted things that only grow in Orleans County or Essex County, way up in the Northeast Kingdom, may die out as the climate warms. But there are lots of barriers to movement of plants. Acorns get carried by blue jays, so they can they can have a new generation maybe a couple of miles away from the mother tree, but then it takes a long time to grow up and get more acorns and move another couple of miles. And of course, our own activities on the landscape have created more barriers to movement, as we're well aware. It's hard to cross an interstate, and it's kind of difficult to naturally move. But there's lots of non-natives here. We have a total flora of about 2,200 species in the state of Vermont, and about 1/3 of them are not native plants. We've brought them here by one means or another, as I said, from all over the world, accidentally. Many of them brought in accidentally, but a lot of things are moved in on purpose. So if we're talking about climate change, do we want those invasive species to be the replacements for things that may be losing out? Or do we want to get other natives here, make them native by enhanced movements? Again, what do we really want? So here's a plant. I hope folks can see. This is Magnolia Tripetala. It's native in the southern Appalachians. I think it makes it up perhaps as far north as Maryland. And is this the sort of thing that we might want to say, well, heavy seeds, difficult to find a lot of barriers if it's going to move north? Maybe we ought to be enhancing the movement of this non-native species to Vermont, because maybe in a few hundred years, the climate that we have here will be conducive to this more southern plant. And actually, not to let the cat out of the bag, but this already is escaping from horticulture in Massachusetts, and they've picked up a number of populations of this plant, which are sort of invasive in the central and eastern Massachusetts. So the question is, again, native or not native? Is it important to have to assist plants moving in response to climate change? Or should we consider this, if it should become established naturally from Massachusetts, say? Would we consider this an invasive plant and try to get rid of it because it perhaps could be displacing something that we have and that we prefer, that we like to have? It's a complicated question for sure. So here's an interesting little problem that we have. Our flora is naturally diminished. Compared to Eastern Asia, we have lots and lots of niches available. The flora of Eastern Asia, which was non-glaciated, China and Korea, Japan, easily double or triple what we have for the natural flora on the landscape. So that implies that we have a lot of unfilled niches for plants. And the question is there room for one more? Well, a few years ago, it became known that there was a colony of this plant, which is on the right-hand side of the white flowers, which is Diapensia Laponica. A circumboreal plant, grows all over the northern hemisphere in the far north, makes it down, scatters down Newfoundland, Labrador, onto the alpine summits of New England. So it's on Mount Katahdin, it's on the White Mountains. And I believe it's in New York State, and there's a small colony of it on Mount Mansfield. But a few years ago, somebody found it on Camel's Hump. Well, now Camel's Hump is about the most botanized place in the whole state of Vermont. All the botanists go there, and the flora is very well known. And so it was a surprise that it could arrive there and be flowering sized plants. I think it's 5 or 6 of them. And the question became, well, is this native or is it not native here? Very hard to grow in a pot or to be transplanted. And Bob Popp, who was a botanist with the Non-Game and Natural Heritage Inventory of the Fish and Wildlife Department, he's a state botanist, spent a lot of effort trying to figure this out as to whether somebody had moved it to Camel's Hump or not. And the jury is still out, but it probably is a natural occurrence, meaning that this actually did get here. Very chancy, probably from the White Mountains or the Adirondacks, onto this tiny patch of habitat on the summit of Mount Mansfield. But even more interesting is growing with it was a plant which is not flowering yet, but we're pretty confident in the identification, is the plant on the left, which is Rhododendron Laponicum, a small ground creeping rhododendron, which is in the White Mountains, but has never been seen in Vermont. But suddenly within the past 10 years or so, there's a small plant of it growing on Camel's Hump. So maybe there is room for one more, and 2 more, 4 more. It's hard to say, but it's an interesting case of trying to determine if something is native or not. And when we know, trying to understand how meaningful is it to us, and how meaningful is it as part of the flora of the state of Vermont. So this is, you probably recognize, is not Camel's Hump, but it's Mount Mansfield. This is looking north from the nose across the parking lot and the public service communications tower in the distance, and then the chin. And Mount Mansfield, of course, has been botanized very, very well. Well, one of the rare things on Mount Mansfield is this natural community, which is called the alpine lawn, which is not really the bare, rocky tundra, but is really like a lawn. It's not wet, it's well drained, but it has a full community of plants across it without rocks popping out of it. Well, in my capacity as a consultant, I was involved with this natural community on the nose, where those communications towers are. They're sort of behind the photographer here. Well, that community, which looked perfectly natural and native, had in it Timothy grass, which is a grass that the Europeans brought for fodder, and there are dandelions, and there's also brown bent grass. They fit in perfectly well, but the question is, do they degrade the natural community? It's possible that they do. And in general, I've botanized not extensively, but some on top of Mount Mansfield, and we think to ourselves, what sorts of things get here? Well, anything with wind-blown seeds like dandelions is very easy to be carried by the wind up over the summit and hit the ground up there during a high wind sometime, and then they become established. There's very little disturbed soil involved in that project with communications towers. And I was tasked with removing any non-native plants that would come into the small areas of disturbed soil. It's different than the alpine lawn. But one of the things that I had a hard time getting rid of was coltsfoot, tussilago, the small little yellow flower that blossoms so early in the spring. That has windblown seeds and is very easily became established up at the summit of Mount Mansfield. Interesting, it's also in cedar swamps and along a lot of streams and so forth. Nobody makes much of it as a displacer, as a real invasive. It's going to be problematic, but it certainly gets around. So we have some world travelers. This is probably the best one, one of the best ones that we know. I apologize, I don't have a picture of the purple loosestrife, which was at the beginning of the show on the entry slide. So this is Phragmites australis, a plant of really worldwide distribution and a serious invasive in Vermont. It has very complicated genetics. As a worldwide distributed species, there are not necessarily varieties, but you might call them families or races or strains, seed strains, I guess you might call them, in various places around the world. This one, the very large flowering and seed heads, is we think probably the European, or one of the European strains, and it's extremely invasive. It is extremely hard to get rid of once it's established because it has is very vigorous and has very deep seated roots and rhizomes, which can just overwhelm wetland habitats, especially. There's an area near West Rutland that has 10 or 15 acres of this, which has completely displaced the natural marsh vegetation down there. It's sort of a hazard too, because there's a grass fire there a few years ago that burned a house trailer because there was so much dry fuel in this swamp in April one year. And when it caught fire, the firemen couldn't get it out in time. Very interesting plant, though. It's is also represented in Vermont by a native race, which is a little less vigorous, not quite as tall, and the seed heads are a little smaller, from sort of a thin stand rather than dense, overwhelming stand. And it occurs around some of the bigger lakes, Lake Memphremagog, Lake Bomazine, some around Lake Champlain, and there may be some inland away from the big lakes as well. But it's kind of complicated when you have it to know which is which. And if you read the invasive websites for various states and so forth, be sure you know which one you have before you try to get rid of it, because you may be trying to get rid of a native race of this extremely interesting grass for many reasons. It had economic uses, it has great functionality on the landscape as well. But we do have some other pretty problematic things, I think. Compared to a lot of places, Vermont does not have very invaded forests. But certainly in the Champlain Valley, and especially down towards Bennington, in the southwestern corner of the state, there are a lot of woodlands that are becoming filled with these two things, at least. The Asian honeysuckles, which are Lindisora morowii or Lindisora tatarica, and Japanese barberry. And they sort of form a shrub layer in what would normally be forest that would just have trees and an herb layer. So they are sort of displacing a lot of our native, there I am, guilty of that word, A lot of our ground flora of wildflowers and the ephemeral things that we are used to seeing in the Vermont woods, the ferns and so forth, are being sort of shoved out by these shade-tolerant shrubs. But as a general rule in Vermont, a lot of our non-native invasives are in more open areas than deep in the forest. Going back to the original slide that I had on of the Helleborine orchid, that's one of the few herbs that are not native that you see way off in the forests, sort of all over the state. I haven't checked out how high up in elevation it goes, but it will tolerate shade, and you can find it in deep forest, far away from logging activity or far away from roads or anything like that, or old agricultural lands. And of course, this is probably one of the most problematic of the invasives that we have in Vermont. Japanese knotweed is from Japan. It was originally introduced for horticultural purposes. A common name for it used to be Japanese bamboo, because it has sort of tall, jointed, hollow stems. And I suppose if you weren't a botanist and really familiar with real bamboo, you might mistake it. But it was planted rather widely, just as an ornamental. But it has gotten going, and Tropical Storm Irene really, which hammered the rivers, as you well know. A lot of the rivers are now just lined with Japanese knotweed from one end to the other. The White River, especially, if anyone drives, say, from Bethel across through to Pittsfield, you can see just the rivers are just lined with Japanese knotweed, and that displaces the natural riparian habitat of the naturally occurring riparian plants. I think quite a bit to the detriment of the ecosystem, because as you all know, the shoreline habitats are very, very important for animals and for fish and for a lot of things. And yet Japanese knotweed is very poorly functional for habitat, and it seems to be sort of a tragedy that really has occupied the state very thoroughly, very rapidly over the past decade or more. But those are things that we think about and we see them a lot, but yet there are very small things as well. This slide shows the species of duckweed in the middle, the big, I say big, but they're smaller than your fingernails. Duckweed, that's many-rooted duckweed, Spirodula polyrhiza. But that small thing, which looks like little tiny eggs floating around in the water, is Wolffia. It's the smallest flowering plant on Earth. Not this particular species. There's one that's even smaller. But Wolffia is a purely aquatic plant, and it reproduces by, it can flower in sepses, but it mostly reproduces just by sort of dividing into two and then dividing into two again, dividing into two again. It's kind of like COVID and the Omicron variant. Divides enough to produce phenomenal numbers in a very short period of time. But yet this plant, which is now all throughout the Champlain Valley system, all over Lake Champlain, and even I think some of the larger lakes, like I believe it's in Bomazine, maybe Lake Dunmore, was not known in Vermont before about 1980. So it's a southeastern continental U.S., but in the southeast, and sort of moved up, gradually moving up through the state. And there's a second species which has been here a little bit longer, but they sort of move from south to north, up across the Lake Champlain Valley. And I think the consequences of it are little known. Of course, we are worried about the phosphorus levels in Lake Champlain, which certainly foster growth of blue-green algae, but it also is pretty helpful to something like this. So is it seen as an invader, or is it seen as something that might be able to sequester some phosphorus? It's kind of hard to know, but I thought it was an interesting example of something that is sort of cryptic. Not many people are familiar with Wolfia, but here it is on our landscape, and it's relatively new on our landscape as well. So I guess I would call that native. And I'd be interested to know what other people think about Wolfia when we get to the question and answer period. And I call it the flash mob, the non-native aquatic species. For some reason or other, probably due to their ability to disperse rapidly by water rather than as airborne seeds or as seeds that depend on gravity or birds or animals to disperse them. We have a number of very problematic invasives in our aquatic ecosystems, especially Lake Champlain. You all know water milfoil and, of course, water chestnut, which was recognized as an extreme problem in the early 1960s and was almost eradicated. But that's another story. Didn't quite get eradicated, and then it bounced back and, as you know, fills up at least the southern end of Lake Champlain. This little white flower here is quite pretty. It's this frogbit, which is a European aquatic plant that was first documented in about 1995 in Lake Champlain, and now is throughout Lake Champlain in 25 years, and is in Lake Bomazene. And I saw recently, not far from your area, there's a big, people are familiar with the swamp in Moncton, where they put in the underpasses beneath the road for the salamanders to get to the breeding grounds in that swamp. That swamp there has the frogbit in it as well. Eurasian water milfoil is in more than 50 lakes statewide. It's even like Willoughby up in the Northeast Kingdom now. And there's another one that's we think may be problematic, Nias. There's 2 or 3 species that are, we've got a couple of ones that are indigenous, but there's a couple from further south that are considered invasive and weeds elsewhere. It sort of remains to be seen whether they will become weedy here in Vermont, but they certainly can go through an aquatic system very rapidly. And probably one of the most dynamic parts of our flora are the aquatic systems. And then there's a little problem with sex, as there often is. On the left is the common cattail of Vermont, the broad-leaved cattail, Typha latifolia. On the right is narrow-leaved cattail, Typha angustifolia. And there's a question even whether that is indigenous in Vermont or even indigenous in the eastern United States. It is mostly coastal and further south and may not even be American. The genetics, some of the brilliant minds are trying to figure this out, far more brilliant than mine. But suffice it to say that it's increasing in Vermont, especially along salted roadsides, because it can tolerate saline conditions. As I said, it's mostly right along the coast. But in the middle is the hybrid between the two. There are no barriers to crossing and making hybrids. And so that one is in the middle. It's called Typha cross glauca, or blue-leaf cattail. And I'm supposed to know which is which, but I find it increasingly hard to tell one from another. And I have the impression that the narrow-leaf cattail is sort of overwhelming the broadleaf cattail in Vermont, producing a whole suite of hybrids that are quite vigorous plants. The intervale at Burlington, if people know where that is sort of filled with Tripetala. But even in many places, I see cattails and I say, well, which one is that? I'm not really sure, because it has characteristics of both narrow-leaved and broadleaf cattail in it. So it's an unusual situation here where we have the native cattail, which of course is practically a wildlife paradise in and of itself, being maybe changed by this coastal one, which is certainly has been helped by the by people salting the roads, especially. We've changed the habitat, we've provided it with habitat, and now it's sort of taking over the native one. And I'll hurry up here a little bit. We have some other world travelers. Weeds in our fields, weeds in our gardens. They are really camp followers. Wherever man is, these things are. We've got lamb's quarters, and we've got purslane. I grew up calling it pusley. Known to have been in Native American gardens at the time of pre-settlement times. And yet today, we can find it on some ledge faces and some cliffs, dry forests. Question is, we don't know if it's native or not, but it too may have been brought here by humans, but not the current crop of humans, but historically by the Native Americans. So we have a few questions here. Do we want to add non-native plants? We apparently have got a lot of niches for them because a lot of them are finding congenial homes here. Or do we want to be rid of them? Well, I certainly would like to be rid of Japanese knotweed on the rivers. We want to recapture the past and make Vermont what it was when we were young. Do we want to have a static or a dynamic environment around us? It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to know. But here's what I think we really want. We want it to be like Goldilocks. We want everything to be just right. We want plants to be happy. We want the environment to be happy. And I think we're all doing our best to try to figure it all out and see what the proper balance is between natives and non-natives. And one more slide for you, which I call Reconnecting Nature. Apples aren't native, but I think everybody's happy to have apples on the landscape. We have the wild apples that have escaped from orchards and so forth. They're great food resources, and they really add a lot to the state, I think. It took botanists many, many, many years to figure out where the domestic apple came from. It was brought here from Europe, from France and England, but just within the past decade, they finally figured out where it evolved. And it evolved in Kazakhstan, where it was co-evolved with bears who disperse the seeds through their gut. And apples find it hard to germinate if they just rot on the ground. The seeds are often killed. But if they pass through a bear's gut, then they are free to germinate. And apples co-evolved with bears. So we've got non-native apples are feeding our native bears, and I think that is just right. So those are my thoughts, and I'm happy to engage in conversations with everybody and see what people think and see what questions they have and so forth. So I guess I'll turn it back now to Steve.
Great, thanks so much. Such great food for thought there with your last slide, especially. So we welcome questions, everybody. I see Fred has posted one in the chat, and go ahead and post your questions there, or just raise your hand. There's so many of us, I'm not sure I will see everybody's hands raised. So if you're being ignored, just speak out. But Fred, do you want to voice your question there?
I guess I have to find it. I think I had a couple. Maybe the cultural significance is what I was thinking about. The cattail, native cattails, I think are edible. I remember as a kid, we used to burn them like punks to keep mosquitoes away. But I've tried to show off to my grandsons and get some of the thin-leaved cattails to burn, and they just don't burn like the old ones do. So maybe some of these plants have more cultural importance than others.
Certainly, we have a lot of plants with a lot of cultural significance, and I sometimes feel sorry. I'm old enough to remember when all the kids knew all the plants, and today I'm afraid that I may be speaking out of turn because I don't really know, but I have the impression that maybe some of them are more interested in their screens than they are in what's growing in the woods out behind them. Someone else have a question?
Cheryl.
Hi. So I have a
Welcome.
comment about and raise a point about what's native and not native, and do we want it and do we not want it? And I think that what's important in my view is that it supports what needs to be supported. It, for example, and one of the things that we're having a big problem with is insect species and population decline. So I think, well, I more than think it, I'm almost positive that really a big issue with the insect decline is the non-native plants. And I don't think I'm talking about non-natives that are coming from not so far away, but more along the lines of the non-natives that are coming from other continents. Because we are having a difficult time giving food to our insects, the larval stage of a lot of the insects. We're giving them pollen and nectar with the non-natives, but we're not feeding the young, the babies. So I think that's really a major problem. And another major problem is when well, you brought this up, is when they really take over and don't let other species grow that are supporting the native, insects and animals and birds, and then they become a monoculture. So I think that becomes a problem when other things, when the natives aren't allowed to grow that are needed.
I agree with you. I think we do see it more with plants from that are not North American. Mm-hmm. We do see it more, especially the East Asian things. Can be the barberry, so it's very invasive and does displace native plants. In regard to insects, you're probably right as well. Of course, one of the most interesting stories that we've come to realize over the past 40 or 50 years is the co-evolution of flowering plants and insects. Right. And they're often very tight correlations. Mm-hmm. There's some insects that only live on one species of plant. There are a lot of specialists among the insects, but then there are a lot of insects. So it's not surprising that there are a lot of specialists among them. So I certainly agree with you that the invasives can be problematic for insects. On the other hand, I'm always surprised at, and I'm not an entomologist. I'm not especially knowledgeable about entomology. And I'm always surprised at how insects can find what they need. you're probably aware of the giant swallowtail butterfly, Crespontes. Help me out with the name. Nymphalis, is Nymphalis Crespontes? Anyway, the giant swallowtail butterfly. Its food plant is prickly ash, which you certainly have an abundance of in Addison County, I must say. It's in the family Rutaceae, which is the citrus family. And so it has this sort of aromatic oil and so forth. And this butterfly, which has just invaded Vermont in the past 15 years or so, since about 2010. I say invaded, it's a natural range expansion is what it is. It has just come into the state and is quite common in some parts of the state. But the folks at the ecologists over in Norwich, the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, Ken McFarland over there was growing. I think he had a correspondent somewhere in central Vermont, was growing a gas plant, which is a member of the Rutaceae family. It's an herbaceous perennial that you grow in flower gardens. Suddenly, miles away from any prickly ash, had some of the giant swallowtail butterflies there. So insects find even the smallest resources, I guess, is what I'd say. But I do agree with you that invasives can be problematic for displacing native plants.
And here and there you find a native insect that can use, well, not here and there, but like a very, a small handful of non-native plants can be used as food.
Right. And once in a while, the insects will switch hosts, so-called. But I think that's not a very common thing.
Yeah.
I have a question. So what classifies an invasive?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that.
Yeah.
Well, the basic idea is that what people consider to be invasives are these displacers, the things that form large populations to the detriment of what we have otherwise. And many of them, the Vermont Department of Agriculture, Food and Markets, about 10 years ago, adopted a quarantine list. It's sort of hard to get at invasives in any kind of legal way, but the Department of Agriculture, Food and Markets can have quarantines where you can't transport ash firewood because it might move the emerald ash borer. And they made a law about 10 years ago that lists about 10 plants that don't even occur in Vermont yet, but are very problematic elsewhere. And then it lists about 20 plants that do occur in Vermont, and that includes purple loosestrife, the common reed, the Phragmites. It lists the Asian honeysuckles. It lists the Japanese knotweed, and so forth. So those are the ones that sort of a panel of botanists and ecologists. It's really more of an ecological question than a botanical question. But they had a panel that's advised them is to develop that list of quarantine plants. It's illegal to transport them over public highways, and some of them it would be illegal to possess. Them, we're supposed to eradicate them if we can. But there's lots of problems with trying to accomplish eradication of invasive plants. It's a very difficult thing to do. Anything else?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
Okay. Right. So I have a question. You raised legality, is it okay? Is it allowed? Is it legal to get rid of plants that are on this invasive list? Or
Yes.
and from anywhere or from only certain places? And also
Well,
burning bush on
anywhere within the state. And of course, the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Agriculture, Food and Markets like you to have a plan to do it. Of course, there's some things you can do legally and other things you can't. You can't just apply herbicides, without an applicator's license. And herbicides, it's very difficult to get an applicator's license to spray in an aquatic environment because herbicides are poisons and they travel very rapidly in the water column. So you can't just go ahead and do what you want. But they did make it legal for you to transport these plants over public highways if they are securely bagged, and when you dispose of them, you can't just throw them on the roadside somewhere. You have to make sure that they really and truly will be killed. So, and I don't think anybody would stop you from doing it. But again, there may be other permits that you might need for hacking away at things on a riverbank. The invasive, the knotweed is actually best. There's a little video on the state's invasive plant website about how to get rid of knotweed. It's very difficult. Basically, you have to cut it about 4 times a year for about 5 years before it finally gives up the ghost. So it's not an easy thing to do, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
In a Judy Dow has raised a question here, and I heard her present this question to the Climate Council as they were considering climate change impacts. Judy, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So it's part of our prophecies, Native American prophecies and stories about the coming together of all plants and animals. And so to create an agency or a state policy that suggests a plant is either invasive or not invasive, prevents our belief system from happening. It prevents our way of thinking that all things will come together. And as you said in the very beginning, there originally wasn't any plants here. They're all introduced. So if they're all introduced, who has the power to decide what is invasive, what is introduced, what can be naturalized, what is native, number one. And number two, if you substitute people for those plants, can you say the same things? Can we say anybody who's not native from this land that is invasive and should not be here?
Well, my own belief is that there are no bad plants. And for a long time, there's been the definition of a weed as being a plant in a place where we don't want it to be. So it is something of an ethical conundrum. As I tried to point out, a lot of it comes down to what we want and not what the plants want.
Or what one particular cultural group wants.
Right. And I think that it's a situation where I mostly think everybody's trying to do their best. And we may be trying to save habitats by getting rid of the colonies of invasive species and so forth. So, on the other hand, I'm not someone who goes out and pulls up invasive species myself, because I sort of take your tack. They have a right to be here as well. But certainly some of them are thugged and maybe need to be restrained in some manner. But it really is a very interesting subject. And I want to thank you all for being invited to give this talk, because it's something I've thought about for quite a long time. I think we do have, we certainly do have a pretty dynamic flora in the state of Vermont. We're constantly adding things. Things are coming and going. And I just find it overwhelmingly interesting without trying to make any judgments about them.
And it's for me, it's traditional to adapt, and adaptation is traditional. And that's what you're seeing going on. You're seeing sweetgrass that grew here 10,000 years ago because of the glacial waters and the salt water. You're now seeing sweetgrass growing in the ditches because we're getting that brackish
because of the salt.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And so change is something that to survive, you have to adapt to. And if you don't accept change, it just passes you by.
That's right.
We're not going to be able to, we can eat every cattail that comes here. We can eat the pollen off every cattail that comes here. If they're adapting and surviving by mating differently, so be it. So are we.
Right. I like your way of thinking. I will say I'm very glad that we brought apples.
Well, ethnobotanists have discovered within 2 years of apples coming to this country, native people were using the bark for cough syrup.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And there actually are North American native apples, mostly in the prairies, but they come east into New York State as well. They're sort of more like a crab apple than what we think of as an eating apple. But they definitely do occur. I've often wondered who's going to find something in Rutland County, Vermont. Yeah.
This is an interesting way to end up our hour here. I want to thank Art for joining us tonight. This has been a great discussion. And Fred and Cheryl and Judy for bringing up great questions, great discussion. Rob, do you have any closing thoughts here?
Yes, I do. So I just want to notify everybody about our upcoming conversation of events that the Sierra Club is doing. First off, we have tomorrow we're doing a planning meeting for about promoting EVs. And we're going to do a flash mob style event. So
it'll be like those aquatic plants.
Yeah. So we're going to plan that one out, but we wanted to invite people while we're planning this out, instead of just saying, hey, this is the date we're doing it. So if you're interested in joining that, and then also next Wednesday at 7 p.m., we have a discussion with Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale about the Environmental Justice Bill and what it particularly proposes to do in Vermont. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation. So I hope you can join us. But all of our conversations are eventually put up on our website. I used to get them all posted within a day. Now with so many other busyness happening, I may not get to it for a couple of days. But everybody who registered, I'll send the link to it once I do post it up online, so you can share it with anybody else. So for that else, thank you very much, Art, for the conversation. Thanks for Suzanne, who on our volunteer team for setting this. Thanks for Steve for facilitating, and thank you all for participating and asking questions and adding to the conversation. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.